Just seconds before he was shot, Malik Turner raised his hands and said, "I don't have a weapon." But that truth had been buried, quietly, deliberately, until Jasmine Crockett stood up and exposed everything. She was the black attorney the system never expected to fight back. Why did they choose Jasmine for this case? And what truth did she force America to finally confront? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. They say this is a hopeless case, but I didn't come here to hope. I came here to do what's right. Jasmine Crockett's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade, sharp and unshaken. Her words echoed off the oak-paneled walls and drew the eyes of every reporter, every juror, every silent doubter in the room. She stood alone at the plaintiff's table, her posture unyielding, her gaze fixed. Behind her, the gallery was packed with city officials, activists, and quiet onlookers, each waiting to see if justice would finally dare to breathe. The tension pressed against the windows like a storm refusing to stay outside. In the front row, a single wooden chair sat empty, a silent monument to Malik Turner, the man whose name filled court documents but whose body lay in the ground, unjustly taken. His wife sat next to the chair, clinging to the hand of their 4-year-old daughter, who played quietly with a pink shoelace. Behind them, Malik's mother bowed her head, gripping an old rosary, her lips trembling without sound. The air was thick with heat, silence, and doubt, until one voice dared to speak. A man 2 rows behind leaned forward, muttering under his breath, just loud enough to be heard. "They gave her the case because she looks right for the cameras." Jasmine didn't flinch, though she heard every word. She had walked into this courtroom knowing she wasn't chosen for her resume, but for the color of her skin and what it might signal to the press. Yet she stood here anyway, not as a symbol, not as a token, but as a woman who refused to let another Black death be filed away without a fight. The judge hadn't entered yet, but the power struggle had already begun. The defense team whispered to one another, smug and settled in their chairs like they'd already won. Jasmine remained silent now, scanning the room. The cameras were rolling, the vultures were watching, and still that empty chair sat unmoved, its silence louder than any objection. The courtroom doors creaked open as Judge Raymond Wallace entered, his black robes sweeping behind him like a shadow. He walked with the ease of a man who'd ruled from that bench for decades, and with the cold detachment of someone who no longer saw people, just case numbers and skin tones. "All rise," the bailiff called. Everyone stood, not in respect, but in quiet resignation. Wallace didn't look at the grieving family. He barely acknowledged Jasmine. His eyes found the defense table first, offering a subtle nod that said everything. This was the judge who routinely sided with police, who dismissed civil rights cases like clearing paperwork. His bias wasn't whispered, it was institutional. Jasmine stood still, jaw clenched. She already knew justice wouldn't come easy in a courtroom where the judge had chosen his side before hearing a word. Wallace sat down, adjusted his robe, and without even lifting his eyes, muttered, "Let's get this over with." The words hit Jasmine like a slap across the face. Get this over with? A man was dead, a child was fatherless, a system had failed, and he treated it like an item on a to-do list. The defense smirked, emboldened by the signal from the bench. Jasmine flipped open her folder, but her fingers paused. For 1 second, she remembered what someone told her once. "You'll never win in his courtroom unless you play by his rules." But Jasmine wasn't here to play. She wasn't here to fit into a system designed to erase men like Malik Turner and women like her. As the court reporter began typing and the first witness was called, Jasmine steadied herself, not because she expected fairness, but because she had decided to fight for it anyway. Jasmine rose from her seat with practiced calm, but her hands were ice cold against the wood of the table. She faced the jury with steady eyes, voice clear and deliberate. "What happened to Malik Turner wasn't a tragic mistake," she began. "It was the predictable result of a system that—" "Ms. Crockett," Judge Wallace cut in sharply, not even looking up from his notes. "Stick to the facts, not the political theater." A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jasmine tightened her grip on the lectern but continued. "The facts are that Malik was unarmed, cooperative, and—" "Ms. Crockett," Wallace interrupted again, louder this time. "This is not a rally. Keep your commentary to yourself." Jasmine took a breath, her heartbeat pulsing in her ears. This wasn't just a courtroom, it was a cage, and every time she tried to speak truth, the walls inched closer. But she pressed on, voice unwavering. What I'm presenting is not commentary, it's evidence. And that evidence— One more warning, the judge snapped, slamming his gavel down once, or you'll be held in contempt. The defense sat back with barely concealed smirks, their silence a smug approval of Wallace's control. Jasmine knew the game being played. Death by interruption. Cut her off enough times, and the jury would lose interest. Discredit her tone, and her argument would feel emotional, not legal. She glanced briefly at Malik's widow, whose eyes pleaded for someone, anyone, to make this court listen. Jasmine's voice dropped, quiet but defiant. The evidence will show you a man who followed every command and still died with his hands in the air. She didn't look at Wallace. She didn't need to. His contempt was already written in the court transcript, line by line. She had walked into this courtroom to give voice to the voiceless, and she would, whether they let her finish or not. From the moment he stood, the defense attorney, Charles Whitmore, wore the smug confidence of a man who thought the courtroom was already his. His tailored gray suit caught the light, but it was the smirk curling at the edge of his mouth that spoke louder than any opening statement. Your Honor, he began, glancing sideways at Jasmine, we do hope this proceeding will focus on the law and not activism. The word hung in the air like poison. He paced slowly, deliberately, addressing the jury as if lecturing a class of schoolchildren. We understand the plaintiff's counsel is relatively new to high-stakes litigation, he said, emphasizing the word new, with a tone dripping in condescension. And while passion has its place, it cannot substitute for legal grounding or objectivity. Jasmine didn't flinch, but her jaw set tight. She had heard it before. Coded language cloaked in professionalism. He wasn't just attacking her experience. He was attacking her presence, her legitimacy, her right to stand in that room. Whitmore turned back to the judge. We simply ask that courtroom decorum be maintained and emotional manipulation be kept to a minimum. The implication was clear. A black woman arguing for a black victim was somehow too emotional to be rational. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Jasmine could feel it. The slow erosion of credibility wasn't always loud. It was quiet, tactical, methodical. Whitmore leaned against his table, feigning concern. This case is about facts, not feelings, he said, casting another sideways glance. And I'm sure opposing counsel understands the difference. The insult was surgical. Jasmine met his gaze without blinking. She wanted to say something, wanted to fire back. But she knew the trap. React, and they'd say she was unstable. Stay silent, and they'd say she was weak. So she did neither. She stood taller, because sometimes dignity was the sharpest weapon in the room. But the truth was, Whitmore's condescension wasn't new. It was just louder, more public. Jasmine had heard the same thing before, only whispered behind closed doors, coded in civility, but cut from the same blade. She remembered it clearly, the hallway outside courtroom 3B, the smell of old coffee and floor wax clinging to the air. Jasmine had just pinned the case file under her arm when a senior colleague, a man with 2 decades of courtroom swagger and a belt full of courthouse gossip, leaned in with a smirk. You know why they gave you this one, right? He whispered, eyes darting to make sure no one else heard. It's optics. You check a box. You're black. That's all. The words hit her harder than he intended, because he didn't say them to wound. He said them like a fact, like weather, like something settled. Jasmine forced a tight smile, said nothing, and kept walking, but the words clung to her like ash. In his voice, she heard what too many thought but never dared speak, that her education, her training, her tireless hours didn't matter, that in rooms full of suits and secrets, she was seen as a symbol, not a lawyer, that her skin got her through the door, but not the respect. She was there to make them remember. And yet, as the evidence phase began, Jasmine felt something shift. Not dramatically, not like a lightning bolt, but like the quiet tightening of a noose, a slow constriction around her fight for the truth. It began with the video. The dash cam footage from Officer Keen's patrol unit was scheduled to be the prosecution's first nail in the coffin. The undeniable proof that Malik Turner, unarmed and calm, had complied before the bullets came. Jasmine stood as the monitor flickered to life. The room fell silent. On screen, Malik appeared, walking slowly out of his vehicle, his palms facing forward, his shoulders low. He didn't run. He didn't argue. He stopped, turned, and raised his hands. It was all there, except the sound. No voice, no sirens, no warning, no last words. The silence on the recording wasn't accidental. It was surgical. It stripped the moment of urgency, of panic, of intention. It erased the officer's tone, the volume of his command, the space between the question and the trigger pull. Jasmine stared at the screen, her heart thudding. "Your Honor," she said, voice clipped and rising, "the audio is missing. We submitted a discovery request weeks ago for full video files, including audio channels." Judge Wallace didn't even blink. "The visual component is intact. That's enough for the jury." "But the audio," she pressed, "would provide context," he said, cutting her off. "We're not here to guess emotions, Miss Crockett. Stick to what can be seen." The gavel came down once, clean, final, cold. It wasn't just silence. It was strategy. Jasmine sat down, her spine rigid, her pen trembling in her grip. Beside her, Malik's widow turned her face away from the screen, as if unable to bear seeing her husband alive and voiceless at the same time. Then came the police reports, as thick and inconsistent as fog. Officer Keen said Malik lunged. Officer Bowers said he flinched. A third report, unsigned and typed with glaring spelling errors, claimed Malik was holding an unknown black object, an object that had never been recovered, photographed, or even defined. Jasmine stood again, flipping through the printed pages like a prosecutor in a corruption trial. 3 different officers, 3 different versions. No physical evidence, no body cam audio. "And yet these are being presented as fact?" she asked, her voice no longer calm. It was steel under pressure. She held up one report. "This officer states that Malik ignored verbal commands." She turned to the screen. "Which ones?" "We don't have the audio." She lifted another. "This report says Malik reached for the back of his pants. The video shows both hands visible at all times." Another document. "This one refers to a suspect who ran northbound. Malik never moved more than 2 feet." She dropped them onto the table. "These are not testimonies. They are contradictions. They don't corroborate. They compete." Wallace adjusted his glasses, exhaled. "The court will admit all reports as submitted." Jasmine turned to him, stunned. "Even the unsigned one?" "That's correct." "With factual errors?" "The jury may weigh that accordingly." His voice was bored, like a teacher tired of a student who asked too many questions. The defense leaned back, satisfied, one of them casually scratching his chin with a gold pen. The jurors glanced between themselves, unsure, confused. Jasmine felt it all slipping. The truth, the weight of what had happened, was right there in front of them, but the system wrapped it in procedure and called it objectivity. She sat down slowly, as if her chair had grown sharper edges. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no outrage, just more silence. The kind that tells you the room was never designed to hear you in the first place. She was surrounded by people, but more alone than ever. The facts were there, but filtered through a lens already fogged with bias. She was a voice in a room full of ears that had long since decided what they wanted to hear. And for a moment, just a moment, Jasmine wondered if the truth could survive when the system itself was allergic to it. But even as the judge moved on, even as the defense prepared their next smug objection, she made herself a silent promise. You don't stop when the system gets loud. You get louder. But if the evidence could be bent to fit a narrative, the questions that challenged it were smothered before they ever left her lips. Jasmine didn't just have to argue. She had to fight for permission to speak at all. Jasmine stood, shoulders square, voice steady, ready to cross-examine Officer Keen, the man whose bullet ended Malik Turner's life. The courtroom leaned in as she walked slowly toward the witness stand, heels tapping like a metronome of purpose. "Officer Keen, You stated that Mr. Turner was non-compliant. Can you specify what command he failed to obey? She asked, her tone sharp but controlled. Objection! The defense barked before the officer could answer. Compound question. Judge Wallace didn't hesitate. Sustained. Jasmine tried again. Did Mr. Turner ever verbally threaten you? Objection. Argumentative. Sustained. Her jaw clenched. She stepped forward, flipping open the officer's report. You wrote that he reached toward his waistband. Do you recall which hand he used? Objection. Assumes facts not in evidence. This time the judge didn't even look up. Sustained again, Miss Crockett. You're skirting the line. She took a breath, deeper this time, and held up the report with both hands. I'm simply quoting the officer's own statement. Enough, the judge snapped, slamming his gavel once. Move on. The courtroom tensed, as if waiting for her to snap, to break, to prove them right. But she didn't. Instead, she straightened, adjusted her blazer, and looked directly at the jury. Let the record reflect that the witness has not answered a single direct question. There was a flicker, a twitch in one juror's eye, a hint of discomfort, but the rest stayed stone-faced, buried in their notebooks. Jasmine stepped back, her pulse racing. Every time she tried to pierce the narrative, she was silenced, not by evidence but by obstruction disguised as order. This wasn't cross-examination. It was a dance on a minefield, where every step toward truth triggered another explosion from the bench. And yet, even with the decks stacked and the walls closing in, she stayed on her feet, because silence was what they wanted, and she refused to give it to them. Outside the courthouse, the headlines had already chosen their side, and Jasmine Crockett wasn't part of it. News outlets aired footage of the trial in short, carefully edited clips, a tense exchange with the judge, a close-up of Jasmine's stern face mid-question, always cut just before the objection. Trial descends into chaos, one anchor declared. Rookie attorney accused of turning courtroom into protest theater, another headline read. They never mentioned the missing audio. They didn't question the contradictory police reports. They didn't dare say Malik Turner's name without adding the word volatile. Cameras weren't pointed at the defense or the judge who silenced her. They were aimed at Jasmine, dissecting her tone, her expression, her presence. Every moment she spoke truth was twisted into a threat. Every time she fought for fairness, it was repackaged as defiance. She wasn't framed as a lawyer pursuing justice. She was cast as a symbol of disruption and, worse, of disorder. She could feel it inside the courtroom, too. Jurors growing colder, the gallery murmuring louder. Even the way the bailiff looked at her had changed, less procedural, more personal. The air had shifted, not from what she had said, but from how the world had decided to hear it. Wallace, the judge, didn't need to say a word. The narrative had already infected the room like smoke through a vent, and Jasmine, standing alone at the eye of the storm, understood exactly what was happening. They weren't just trying to undermine her case, they were trying to erase her voice, piece by piece, until all that remained was silence they could control. But Jasmine had been underestimated before, and this time the silence wouldn't win, not while she still had breath, not while that empty chair in the front row still screamed for justice. She was losing ground, and she could feel it. Every objection sustained, every question cut short, every glance from the judge that said, "Know your place." Jasmine could hear the silent verdict forming long before any jury was asked to speak. Her voice had been trimmed down to sound bites, her logic drowned beneath legal formality. She turned slightly just for a second, needing something, anything to hold on to. That's when she saw her. Malik's daughter, seated beside her mother, no longer fidgeting, no longer twirling her shoelace. The little girl was staring straight at her, eyes wide, not in awe, not in curiosity, but in something deeper, sharper. Fear. It was the kind of fear no child should carry, the fear of watching grown-ups lie and the world pretend it's justice. Jasmine felt it slice through her chest like glass. That look said everything. Don't let them win. She inhaled slowly, the noise of the courtroom falling away, and held her stare just long enough to answer without words. Then she turned back to the bench, spine straight, voice reset, not louder but harder. The judge tapped his pen, bored. The defense whispered behind smirks. But Jasmine was no longer speaking only for the court record. She was speaking for the one person in that room too young to understand injustice, but old enough to feel its weight. As she gathered her notes, her fingers trembled, not from fear but from fury she had learned to master. Beneath her breath, just loud enough for herself to hear, she muttered, "They hired me to stay quiet, but I didn't come here to be silent." And as she stood there alone but unshaken, the room didn't know it yet, but the fight had only just begun. But the courtroom wasn't done trying to shrink her. Just as she gathered the strength to rise again, the next blow came. Not from the bench, but from across the aisle, cloaked in politeness and aimed straight at her worth. The moment had the quiet precision of a blade sliding out of a sheath. No warning, no stumble, just the cold, deliberate cut of words meant to wound. Charles Whitmore stood in the center of the courtroom, with his hands folded in front of him like a priest ready to offer benediction. His tone was gentle, but his eyes gleamed with calculated malice. "Forgive me for asking, counselor," he said, turning toward Jasmine as if he were offering her a courtesy. "But I think it's a fair question for the jury to consider. Were you assigned to this case because of your credentials, or perhaps because of how you'd look standing here?" He let the implications settle like smoke creeping beneath a door. "We all know how public this trial has become. One might wonder whether your presence here was intentionally symbolic." A hushed murmur fluttered across the gallery. One juror blinked, another shifted in their seat, uncertain. The defense table sat smug, lips pressed to hide smirks. Even Judge Wallace didn't intervene. He leaned back. Let it happen. Let the poison do its work. This wasn't just a jab. It was a public attempt to reduce Jasmine to her skin color, to a box ticked by an administration desperate to appease a media storm. To them, she wasn't a lawyer. She was theater, a diversity hire in a tailored blazer. Jasmine didn't answer right away. She didn't flinch or fire back. Instead, she slowly closed the folder in front of her, calmly capped her pen, and stepped out from behind the table. Her heels echoed softly against the tile floor, one deliberate step after another, until she stood directly in the center of the courtroom. Her hands were steady, her breathing calm, but her eyes burned. And when she spoke, the room froze. "You want to know if I was hired because I'm black?" she said, her voice low but unshakably clear. "Yes." The word cracked through the silence like thunder. "I was." She turned to the jury now, her gaze never wavering. "Let's not pretend. They picked me because I fit the photo op, because I made their progress look palatable. A black woman in the courtroom, strong enough to defend, but silent enough not to disrupt. They thought I'd keep my head down, smile politely, ask safe questions, and go home when told." She paused, eyes narrowing. "But what they didn't expect, what none of them expected, was that I see exactly what's happening in this room, and I refuse to look away." She took another step forward. The gallery leaned in without realizing. "I see Breonna Taylor, shot in her sleep, and the system called it a mistake. I see George Floyd, knee on his neck, and the court said, reasonable force. I see Eric Garner, choked to death for selling loose cigarettes, and the response was silence." Her voice rose, sharp and urgent. "And now I see Malik Turner, a man with his hands up, a man who said, 'I don't have a weapon,' a man who was still shot dead, then blamed for it afterward." She turned toward Whitmore now, meeting his eyes with the full force of her fire. "You think I'm here to make this trial look legitimate? You think I'm here because I photograph well?" She shook her head. I'm here because I'm the only one in this room willing to call this what it is, a cover-up dressed as due process." The judge shifted uncomfortably, finally reaching for his gavel, but she wasn't done. She pivoted back to the jury. "This isn't about representation, it's about recognition. The system keeps giving us body bags and calling them accidents. It tells us to stay calm, stay civil, stay quiet. But that quiet is a graveyard. And I didn't come here to dig another hole. I came here to fight for the truth they're trying to bury with legal jargon and redacted files." Her voice dropped to a whisper, tight with control but packed with fury. "So yes, I was hired because I'm black. But I stayed because I'm the only one who still sees Malik as human, and I will not let you turn his death into a footnote just to keep this machine running clean." The courtroom didn't breathe. Jasmine's words hung in the air like a live wire. Crackling, dangerous, undeniable. No one moved. Not a cough. Not a whisper. The judge, who had interrupted her a dozen times before, now sat frozen, eyes narrowed, lips tight. The defense team, usually smug and restless, stared ahead, rigid. And the jury, 12 strangers who had spent the past days avoiding eye contact, now looked directly at her. One woman had tears in her eyes. One man's jaw was clenched. Jasmine hadn't just shaken the room. She had exposed it, laid it bare, called it by name. And for one suspended moment, the machinery of that courtroom stopped turning. But the system doesn't like to be exposed. Judge Wallace cleared his throat, louder than necessary. The sharp crack of his gavel broke the silence. Not to reprimand, not to redirect, but to reclaim control. "Let's proceed," he said, voice clipped, avoiding her eyes. The transcript would record it as a neutral cue. But everyone in that room knew what it was. A warning, the kind you don't have to spell out. The defense shuffled their papers, trying to look unaffected. Reporters glanced at one another, then down at their notes, scribbling furiously to capture what they knew would lead every evening's segment. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but the story had already escaped its walls. Jasmine sat down, slow and composed, but she could feel the shift like a ripple under her skin. This wasn't triumph, it was exposure. And exposure comes at a cost. She didn't need a verdict to know what was coming next. Her words would be clipped, taken out of context, looped on the news with headlines like, "Young Lawyer Sparks Chaos in Courtroom," or "Racial Outburst Derails Trial." They wouldn't talk about Malik Turner. They wouldn't show the contradictions in the officers' reports. They would fixate on her tone, her volume, her audacity to speak truth in a place built to suppress it. And yet, despite it all, she didn't regret a single word. Not when she looked at the front row and saw Malik's mother silently crying, hands gripping her rosary like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Not when she saw Malik's daughter, now wide awake, clinging to her mother's sleeve with both hands. And not when she turned back to the judge's bench and said, with nothing more than a look, "I'm still standing," because truth always comes with a price, and Jasmine had already decided she was willing to pay it. The courtroom hadn't recovered from Jasmine's statement. Even after Judge Wallace struck his gavel and muttered, "Let's proceed," no one truly did. The gallery was still wide-eyed. The jurors were shaken. The defense fumbled to reorganize. And Wallace, for all his authority, seemed rattled, his usual disdain now shadowed by unease. Moments later, under the guise of preserving order, he recessed the court until Monday morning, claiming the proceedings had become too emotionally charged to continue uninterrupted. But Jasmine knew what it really was: a pause to regain control, a breathing space for the system, not for justice. As the courtroom emptied, the air still humming from her words, she gathered her case files in silence. Her pulse hadn't slowed. Something in the judge's eyes had told her. They weren't retreating. They were regrouping. Something was coming, or being hidden. She was halfway down the marble corridor, heels echoing like warnings, when she noticed a man watching her from near the stairwell. He wasn't in uniform. Civilian clothes, late 40s, tired posture, a badge clipped hastily to his belt. DPD Technical Services. Their eyes met. He looked down, hesitated, then walked toward her quickly but discreetly. "Ms. Crockett," he asked, voice barely above a whisper, "I need to give you something, but you didn't get it from me." She stiffened, heart already racing. He handed her a plain envelope, no seal, no markings. "Don't open it here," he said. "Just do it somewhere no one can see you." He turned, walked away. No name, no small talk. Gone. In the privacy of her car, Jasmine tore the envelope open with shaking hands. Inside was a single-page memo, stamped "internal use only," dated 10 days before trial. Her eyes locked onto one line and refused to move. "Audio channel on dash cam disabled manually upon request of supervising officer due to content sensitivity." Her lungs forgot how to breathe. It wasn't a glitch, not a hardware error, not corrupted data. It was erased, intentionally, officially, with bureaucratic precision. The video that could have proven Malik Turner was calm, compliant, and unarmed had been muted on purpose. A silencing that was not only moral but now provable. The next hour blurred into furious typing, evidence cross-checking, and legal fire. Jasmine barricaded herself in her office, phone on silent, blinds drawn, laptop open, case files scattered like a battlefield. Every word of the emergency motion had to hit like a hammer. Formal petition for a judicial order to compel forensic recovery of all dashcam audio files from the night of Malik Turner's shooting. Demand for full metadata, chain of custody logs, and documentation of internal tampering. She cited the memo as Exhibit A, scanned, time-stamped, attached in triplicate. Every paragraph struck with precision, no fat, no fluff, just sharp legal teeth. She ended it with a single line in bold. The silence in this case was not technical, it was deliberate. By 2:41 a.m., the motion was submitted to the clerk's inbox, flagged urgent. But Jasmine didn't stop there. She printed 4 hard copies, threw on her coat, and drove straight to the courthouse. She arrived under the pale glow of the courthouse's exterior lamps, her breath fogging in the cold air, her shoes striking the empty floor like defiance. The building was closed, but she knew the side entrance where night staff rotated. She knocked hard. After a long pause, a security officer opened the door, startled to see her. "I need to see the overnight clerk," she said without blinking. "Now." 10 minutes later, a sleepy staffer appeared behind the bulletproof glass of the record window. Jasmine slid the motion through. "This must reach Judge Wallace's chambers by 9 a.m. It's a matter of judicial integrity, and if it disappears, I will file a federal obstruction complaint myself." The clerk blinked, awake now. He nodded, took the file, and disappeared into the depths of the building. Jasmine walked out into the night without looking back. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt electric, like the air before lightning, because now she had proof. And if the court refused to hear Malik Turner's voice, she would force them to. 2 days later, it arrived. A secure drive, hand-delivered under court order, with a short, sterile note, recovered audio file, unredacted. Jasmine didn't wait. She locked her office door, closed the blinds, inserted the drive, and pressed play. At first, there was only the familiar dashcam footage, Malik stepping out of his vehicle, palms raised, shoulders stiff with fear. But then came the sound, raw, unfiltered, devastating. "I don't have a weapon," Malik shouted, his voice clear, desperate, human. Jasmine froze, her lungs forgetting to function. "I'm not resisting. I'm not doing anything." Then came the shots. 3 sharp cracks, too fast, too final. And then silence. No commands, no warnings, just execution. She pressed pause. Her hands were trembling. This was it. The moment they'd buried, the truth they had wiped from the official record. Not lost, not corrupted, deleted, because it told the story they couldn't defend. She rewound it, played it again. Malik's voice cracked in the same place. The fear in his tone wasn't theatrical. It was real, undeniable, and damning. Jasmine knew exactly what she was holding. Not just evidence, not just audio. She was holding the voice of a dead man the system had tried to erase, and now that voice was back, louder than ever and impossible to ignore. She had listened to his voice in the silence of her office. Raw, terrified, unforgettable. But now it was time for everyone else to hear it too. Not through her arguments, not through transcripts, through Malik Turner himself, in his own words, in his final breath. The courtroom was silent before the playback even began. Not the respectful silence of legal decorum, but something far more dangerous. Anticipatory, unsteady, like a held breath before an earthquake. Jasmine stood beside the monitor, her posture calm but charged, one hand on the remote, the other resting lightly on the evidence table. She looked straight at the jury, then toward the judge. "What you are about to hear," she said, her voice low and clear, "is the truth this court was never meant to hear." Then she pressed play. The screen lit up. The familiar dash cam footage appeared. Malik Turner stepping out of his car, hands raised, movements slow and deliberate. But this time, there was sound. Real sound. "I don't have a weapon!" His voice echoed through the speakers, sharp with fear, crystal clear, utterly human. The words slammed into the room like a steel door blown open. "I'm not resisting. Please, I'm not doing anything." And then, bang, bang, bang. 3 rapid shots, then silence. Not silence from the recording. Silence in the room. The kind that feels like the aftermath of a collapse. Someone in the gallery let out a short, involuntary cry. One juror, a middle-aged man who had barely reacted to anything all week, lowered his head and clenched his jaw. A woman in the front row covered her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks before she could catch them. Another wiped his glasses, even though they weren't fogged. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't speak. She let the footage roll. Malik's body falling out of frame. The officers shouting contradictory commands over each other after he was already down. She paused the video at the last frame. Malik, face pressed to the concrete, unmoving. Then, and only then, she turned back to the jury. "They said it was a malfunction," she said, her voice steady but with an edge that cut straight through the room. "They said the audio was corrupted, unavailable, irrelevant." She held up the court-stamped memo. But it wasn't. It was deleted. Deleted on purpose. Because someone in the department decided this man's voice didn't belong in their version of the truth. She took a step forward. This wasn't just evidence. It was a human being's last words, and they tried to erase them. The defense team sat frozen, color draining from their faces. Judge Wallace shifted in his chair, visibly rattled for the first time, not just by the evidence, but by how naked the system now looked under the harsh light of exposure. Jasmine continued, her voice now razor-sharp. "Malik Turner did everything they say a black man should do when stopped by police. He followed orders. He raised his hands. He begged for his life, and they shot him anyway." Her words cracked against the wood and plaster like hammer blows. Then they tried to bury the only part of him that could speak for itself. She let that sit. Let them feel the weight of it. Then quietly she whispered, not to the jury, not to the judge, but to the room itself. "He was never silent. They just wanted you to believe he was." For a moment no one could speak. The silence wasn't courtroom etiquette anymore. It was shame. Raw, collective, and too late. And Jasmine, still standing, still burning, had just made them all hear it. Every word, every plea, every bullet, every lie. The door at the back of the courtroom opened slowly, not with the usual force of a bailiff or a late-arriving reporter, but with the hesitant weight of someone carrying far more than just himself. Arnold Hayes stepped in, shoulders stiff, eyes lowered, the lines on his face looking carved rather than aged. The courtroom didn't know what to make of him. Some in the gallery whispered. The defense attorney blinked and leaned in to consult his colleague. Even Judge Wallace tilted slightly in his chair, recognizing the name on the subpoena Jasmine had submitted 2 days earlier, but clearly not expecting Hayes to actually show. He walked with a noticeable limp, not from injury, but from time. His hand gripped the rail as he climbed into the witness stand, each step deliberate. Jasmine watched him closely, not to see if he would break, but to measure whether the system had ever truly cracked him at all. The clerk raised her hand for the oath. Hayes raised his in return. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "Yes," he said, but the word didn't come out easily. It was dragged up from somewhere deep. He adjusted the microphone and looked out into the room. His voice when it came was slow, gravel-lined, but steady. "My name is Arnold Hayes. I served with the Dallas Police Department for 33 years. I retired in 2017 after spending most of my time training new recruits." He paused. No one interrupted. "I'm here because something's been eating at me since I saw the name Malik Turner come across the news." Jasmine stepped forward, no notes in hand. "Sergeant Hayes, did you know Officer Keene or any of the officers involved in Mr. Turner's shooting?" "I knew of them. Trained one of them years ago. Not well, but this isn't about them," he said. "It's about all of us." The room stiffened. "I've seen a lot in 3 decades. But what I saw in that dash cam footage broke something in me." His voice trembled, just for a second. Because it wasn't new. It was familiar, routine, predictable. He leaned forward slightly. We were trained to be alert, yes. Trained to assess threats, stay alive, stay sharp. But between the lines, between the lectures and the manuals, we were conditioned to fear black men. A gasp escaped from the back row. Someone dropped a pen. I won't dress it up, Hayes continued. They didn't say it outright, not in words, but in scenarios, in drills, in the way we were told to react fast when the suspect was aggressive. Always a black man. In the videos we were shown of non-compliant subjects, always black. The body language we were trained to watch for, always tied to black faces. It was everywhere. Subtle, constant, and corrosive. He paused, taking in the faces before him. Some jurors were motionless, others visibly disturbed. Jasmine said nothing. She just let him speak. We called it officer safety, Hayes said. But it wasn't safety. It was fear. Manufactured, injected into us early and reinforced every day. And that fear got people killed. His hands were clenched now, resting on the rail. We didn't teach recruits to de-escalate when the suspect was black. We taught them to assert control. We taught them to dominate. We taught them that hesitation could get them killed, but never asked what fear might do to the people they were confronting. The courtroom had gone still again. I thought the system would change after Eric Garner, he continued. I thought maybe George Floyd would make them see. Then Breonna Taylor. Then Elijah McClain. Each time I said nothing. I wrote letters and never sent them. I retired and told myself I'd done enough. But when I saw Malik Turner, hands up, saying he had no weapon, and then I heard those shots, I realized something that shattered me. He looked directly at the jury. His voice broke. My silence is part of why he is dead. Gasps turned to tears. A woman in the jury box pressed a tissue to her eyes. One man folded his arms tightly across his chest as if to contain something rising inside him. The defense attorney was rigid, pen frozen mid-scribble. I trained officers who went into the streets with fear in their hearts and a gun on their hip, and I never once asked myself if that fear was justified or dangerous. He turned to Jasmine. That makes me complicit. And if I want to leave this world with even a shred of peace, then the least I can do is stop pretending I didn't know. Jasmine approached the witness stand slowly, carefully. Her mouth opened, but no words came. What could she ask that hadn't already been said? What cross-examination could clarify the pain in his voice? Instead, she placed her hand on the edge of the stand and simply nodded. Thank you, Sergeant Hayes. He nodded back, his shoulders slack now, as if he'd been carrying a secret for decades and had finally laid it down. Jasmine returned to her table without a word. The judge didn't speak. The gallery didn't stir. The silence that followed wasn't defensive or dismissive. It was sacred, a reckoning. For once, in that courtroom, no one needed to argue. No one needed to raise their voice, because the truth had already been spoken. And this time, it stayed in the room. The courtroom was electric, silent, but charged with the kind of tension that made breathing feel like a risk. Everyone was standing now, rows of spectators packed shoulder to shoulder, press huddled in the back with cameras ready. And in the center of it all, Jasmine stood frozen beside the plaintiff's table, her hand resting on the edge like an anchor. The bailiff re-entered with a stiff nod, carrying the folded sheet that would either validate everything or bury it. The foreperson of the jury, a woman in her late 50s with eyes rimmed red, stood and cleared her throat. Her voice shook, but not from uncertainty. In the matter of Crockett versus City of Dallas, she said, we, the jury, find the defendant liable. A beat. We find that the City of Dallas bears responsibility in the wrongful death of Malik Turner. Gasps burst from the gallery, raw, involuntary. One of Malik's relatives let out a sob that echoed like a crack of thunder. Jasmine's knees almost buckled, but she gripped the table tighter, jaw clenched, eyes burning. For a moment, she couldn't move. She had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways, but nothing could prepare her for the weight of hearing those words. Words the system wasn't supposed to allow, a verdict it had fought to smother. The judge's face was blank, unreadable. The defense attorneys stared straight ahead, their silence louder than any objection they'd ever made. Jasmine exhaled slowly, a single breath that seemed to release months of fury, pressure, and pain. But this wasn't victory. Not really, because Malik was still gone. Justice had spoken, yes, but too late, too costly. And even now, the weight of what it had taken to get here pressed against her chest like a brick. Still, the truth had made it into the record. Not as an outburst, not as an ignored voice, but as a verdict. And that meant the silence that once protected power had finally cracked. The moment the verdict was read, the dam broke. Malik's wife collapsed into her seat, sobbing into her hands, her body heaving with the kind of grief that had been held in check far too long. Their daughter, too young to understand the legal weight of the decision, clung to her mother's side, frightened by the noise but sensing something had shifted. In the front row, Malik's mother, stoic until now, stood slowly, her knees trembling, eyes glistening with tears that refused to be contained any longer. She made her way toward Jasmine, step by deliberate step, through a silence carved open by sorrow and vindication. Jasmine turned, eyes still wet, unsure of what to expect. Without a word, the older woman reached out, her hands weathered but strong, and took Jasmine's hand in both of hers. Her voice cracked with emotion, barely louder than a whisper, but every word hit like thunder. "I didn't believe in you," she said, eyes locked onto Jasmine's. "But you didn't leave us. You didn't walk away." Jasmine felt something inside her shatter and settle all at once. All the dismissals, the headlines, the procedural blocks, the accusations, they had built walls around her. But this tore through them. She tightened her grip around the mother's hands, not as a lawyer, not as a symbol, but simply as one woman holding another in the aftermath of shared loss. Around them, the room buzzed with murmurs, camera shutters, and the sound of justice arriving far too late. But in that circle of contact, skin to skin, soul to soul, none of that mattered. This wasn't closure. It wasn't peace. It was something deeper, quieter, more powerful. Recognition. In the end, Jasmine hadn't just won a verdict. She had restored a voice. And for the first time, someone who had lost everything could say the words that mattered most. You stayed. The doors of the courthouse creaked open with the weight of history still clinging to their hinges. And when Jasmine Crockett stepped through them, the world outside erupted. A wall of cameras flared like lightning. Reporters surged forward, elbows locked in a quiet brawl for inches of ground. Boom mics hovered just above her head like predators circling prey. The crowd spilled into the streets, hundreds, maybe thousands, held back by yellow tape and weary officers who had spent days trying to contain a movement too large to fence in. She stood on the top step in the full light of the late afternoon sun, not a bead of sweat on her brow, not a quiver in her breath. Behind her, the heavy courthouse doors slowly creaked shut, sealing the verdict inside, but leaving its consequences roaring outside. They had come for a reaction. She was about to give them a reckoning. Flashes snapped, recorders beeped, and then came the voice. A reporter pressed up against the line, voice cutting through the noise like a scalpel. "Ms. Crockett, do you still believe you were selected just because you're black?" The air changed instantly. The crowd's breath hitched. Cameras zoomed. Even the sun seemed to pause behind a cloud. The question was bait, polished, provocative, dangerous, designed to undo her victory with a single misstep. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood still, surrounded by chaos, and looked directly at the reporter. Her silence at first was deafening, not hesitation, but calculation. She scanned the crowd, students holding protest signs, an elderly couple in church clothes with Malik's photo on a laminated poster, a row of local journalists balancing notebooks on their knees, and behind them, even members of the city council who hadn't dared enter the courtroom, now trying to share its spotlight. She gave them what they didn't expect, a smile. Not one of triumph, not one of vengeance. It was a tired, honest smile, a smile that had weathered every objection, every smirk, every procedural slap in the face. She stepped forward, just enough to meet the question head on. "Maybe," she said simply, her voice firm, rising just above the crowd's edge. Maybe I was chosen because I'm black. She paused. The cameras blinked wildly like stunned eyes. But I stayed because I was the only one who wouldn't stay silent. The crowd didn't cheer. Not right away, because it wasn't a moment meant for applause. It was meant for reflection, for recognition. The silence afterward was louder than any ovation. It settled over them like gravity. And when the cheering finally did erupt, raw, unscripted, real, it wasn't celebration. It was release. Jasmine nodded once, then turned. She didn't linger for sound bites. She didn't wait for the network vans to catch up. She turned her back to the frenzy and walked down the courthouse steps with slow, grounded purpose. The crowd parted for her, not because they were told to, but because they understood, intuitively, collectively, that this woman had just carried something no one else dared lift. And now she was walking it into history. Behind her, visible through the courthouse's towering glass doors, stood that same wooden chair. The empty one. The one they had placed quietly, almost dismissively, behind the plaintiff's table. A silent placeholder for Malik Turner, whose body was gone, but whose name now thundered through every courthouse corridor and television screen across the country. But now the chair wasn't empty anymore. Now it was full, not with a man, but with memory, with meaning, with the weight of a city's silence, and the voice that had refused to let that silence win. People stopped to photograph it. Some wept. Some knelt beside it. Someone placed a single folded note on the seat. I see you now. Someone else laid a white rose. One young girl, no more than 10, stood in front of it with her hand over her heart, saying nothing, but watching. A drone camera hovered, beaming the image live to millions. The courtroom behind glass, the woman walking away, the chair that no longer blended into the woodwork. And Jasmine, she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, every step echoing not just off the pavement, but off history itself. She didn't need a podium. She didn't need headlines. She didn't need to shout. Her work, her war, had already spoken loud enough. Because sometimes the loudest act of resistance is walking away with your head high, knowing you told the truth in a place built to erase it. And behind her, the chair stayed, still, visible, and finally seen. It began with a single invitation from a third-year student at Howard Law who had seen the trial replayed on the evening news and had watched Jasmine's final statement more times than he could count. That invitation turned into 10, then 20. Within months, Jasmine Crockett, once dismissed as a diversity hire and called too emotional for court, had become the most requested guest lecturer at law schools across the country. Harvard, Columbia, NYU, Spelman, Georgetown, Berkeley. Her name traveled faster than the verdict, but it wasn't celebrity they were chasing, it was reckoning. Jasmine wasn't offering inspiration, she was offering disruption. And when she stepped onto the stage at Yale Law that crisp October evening, the atmosphere didn't feel academic. It felt like a live wire. 1,000 future lawyers packed into the auditorium, crammed against walls, sitting shoulder to shoulder on stairs and floors. No ambient music, no warm-up speaker, just a long electric silence as the moderator nervously introduced her. Civil rights attorney, litigator, advocate, and the woman who made the city of Dallas answer for Malik Turner. She walked out slowly, no flashy suit, no entourage, just a navy blazer, loose curls tucked behind one ear, and a folder pressed flat against her side like a shield. The applause that greeted her was thunderous, but Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't bow. She waited for the sound to die like she waited for a courtroom to quiet before dropping the kind of truth that left judges reaching for their gavels. She stood at the podium, looked out over the sea of fresh ambition, and then she spoke, not with rehearsed charisma, but with surgical precision. I was chosen because I'm black, she said flatly. They thought that would be enough. Optics, diversity, something they could point to while they buried the truth in procedure and paperwork. But I stayed, because I refused to be quiet, because silence is how people like Malik Turner get erased. The room froze. Phones stopped recording. Pens stopped scratching. It was like she'd sucked the oxygen out of the room and replaced it with fire. I was trained to think the law was neutral, she continued, voice low but rising. They told me the courtroom was sacred, that facts mattered more than emotion, that if I just worked hard enough, stayed polite enough, and waited long enough, justice would eventually arrive. But here's the truth. Justice doesn't walk into the courtroom on her own. You have to drag her in, and sometimes she kicks and screams the whole way. A murmur of unease moved through the rows. Jasmine pressed forward. I watched a judge pretend not to hear a man's dying words because the audio was missing. I watched police lie on sworn statements because they knew the system would protect them. And I watched the media try to turn my courtroom into a circus because they couldn't imagine a black woman standing her ground and winning. She paused. The room was holding its breath. You'll graduate and think the robe makes the judge fair, that the badge makes the officer honest, that the title makes your client innocent. But don't be fooled. These systems are built to protect power, and power protects itself first. A hand in the third row twitched, hesitated, then lowered. Jasmine saw it and nodded. You want to ask if it's always this bad, if the system really is that broken. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. I used to think it just needed fixing, but now I know it needs unlearning. Gasps, shifts in posture. One student in the back was already crying silently. She stepped out from behind the podium now, walking slowly along the edge of the stage. Her heels echoed in the heavy silence. Some of you will become prosecutors, judges, partners at firms that pay more in settlements than they do in salaries. Some of you will argue for companies that fund the very police departments you're trying to reform. And you'll tell yourselves, I'm just doing my job. She stopped and looked directly at one student in the front row, wide-eyed, shoulders tense. But here's what I want you to remember. Every time you stay quiet to keep your career safe, you make silence louder. Every time you accept a lie because it's been notarized, you kill something real. She turned back to the crowd. Her voice sharpened. Not louder, just sharper, cleaner. When I played that video in court, when I made the world hear Malek Turner say, I don't have a weapon, right before he was shot, people told me it was courageous. It wasn't courage, it was obligation. Courage is a choice, but obligation is truth with claws. It won't let you sleep. It won't let you look away. She clenched her fist slightly just once. And if you don't feel that obligation, you shouldn't be holding anyone's life in your hands. Not as a lawyer, not as a judge, not as a juror, not as a human being. The room broke. Not into applause, but into stillness. Emotional stillness. One student lowered his phone. Another shut her laptop without saving. A young black woman in the third row wiped her cheek with her sleeve, then sat up straighter. Jasmine returned to the podium and placed her notes face down, untouched. They invited me to speak today because they think I won something, she said. But what I won was a city's shame. What I carried was a man's death. And what I left behind was a chair that no one could ignore anymore. She looked out over the room one last time. You want justice? Start by learning how many doors it won't walk through. Then decide if you're brave enough to break them open. She stepped back. No music played. No moderator returned. The room stood on its own, rising to its feet as one. Some applauding, most just staring. Not at a celebrity, not at a legal scholar, but at a woman who had once been told to stay quiet and instead made the whole world listen. Justice doesn't arrive on time. It drags its feet. It shows up late, bruised and half-broken, if it shows up at all. That was the lesson Jasmine Crockett learned in a courtroom where silence was louder than evidence, and procedure was weaponized to strangle truth. She didn't step into that trial with illusions. She knew what she was up against, a judge who had already chosen a side, a defense that mocked her intelligence at every turn, and a system that had trained itself to be numb to the deaths of men like Malek Turner. But what she didn't expect, what hit her like a second bullet, was how easily the world moved on from injustice unless someone dragged them back into the moment and made them look. Really look. It wasn't just about law. It wasn't about rules or objections or admissible evidence. It was about something deeper, something rotting beneath the marble columns and Latin mottos of justice. The idea that some lives are quieter than others, that some bodies fall without echo, and that silence, when polished enough, can pass for due process. Malik Turner didn't die in chaos. He died in clarity. Hands raised, voice calm, words recorded, erased. And what almost followed wasn't an investigation. It was a burial of facts, of accountability, of memory. The chair left empty for him in that courtroom wasn't a gesture. It was a challenge. And Jasmine knew the weight of what she carried when she stood beside it. Because the truth is, no system fixes itself. Injustice doesn't self-correct. And silence is not neutral. It's a choice. Jasmine learned that real justice starts where comfort ends. It begins with confrontation, with someone refusing to accept the official version, with someone demanding the missing audio, the missing report, the missing truth. And even when you find it, even when you drag it into the light, it won't speak for itself. You have to give it a voice. You have to stand in a room that was designed to ignore you and force it to listen. Jasmine didn't win because she out-argued the other side. She won because she outlasted a machine designed to grind her down. She won because she refused to sit quietly while others turned pain into protocol. And in doing so, she taught everyone watching, jurors, judges, journalists, and ordinary people, that justice isn't polite. It's not polished. It's not patient. Sometimes justice screams. Sometimes it shows up in a woman who was underestimated, dismissed, and told to smile for the camera while the city buried another black man with legal paperwork instead of a headstone. But maybe the deepest lesson, the one that sat with people long after the news cycle moved on, was this. One person can still make the system shake, not by being loud, but by being unbreakable, by refusing to trade truth for favor, by standing in a courtroom where everything is stacked against you and saying, this life mattered. This lie stops here. Jasmine didn't come to win. She came to testify. And in doing so, she made others testify too. Officers, jurors, citizens, and eventually a city. So if there's a lesson to carry from this story, it isn't just that justice is hard. It's that silence is easier and far more dangerous. It's that too many people have died because no one wanted to make noise. And it's that sometimes the most radical act of all is to speak, to stay, to not walk away, even when everything in the system tells you you're not supposed to be there. Because justice doesn't live in courtrooms. It lives in people who refuse to leave empty chairs unnoticed. And now because one woman stayed, the world saw what they tried to bury, and they can never unsee it again. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.